My name is Winterbourne Harrison Jones, and I'm a second-year Masters of Arts student here at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And it has been my honor to serve as the chairperson alongside my other student colleagues, which many of you met on your way in for today's event. And so first I say welcome and thank each of you for being here this afternoon. It was William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, better known as W.E.B. Du Bois, the great American civil rights activist, sociologist, scholar, and co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP, who wrote in his 1903 essay entitled The Talented Tenth. He wrote these words. He said that education is that whole system of human training within and without the school walls, which molds and develops men. While the gender-exclusive language which Du Bois uses is indicative of the zeitgeist or the spirit of the age in which he lived, the ethos of his words are yet true. That education in all of its forms is a holistic and diverse enterprise which is not confined exclusively to the classroom, but belongs to the world and all of its peoples. This is why today's event, in celebration of Black Heritage Month and the Black philanthropic tradition, is so fitting to the mission of the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, which labors in all that it does to embody its core values of inclusiveness and diversity. We dare not allow the month of February or any month to pass without remaining true to these two core values, which make us who we are. And so, as we as a school continue in our quest to increase the understanding of philanthropy and improve the practices worldwide through critical inquiry, disciplinary research, training, teaching, and civic engagement, we think it not robbery to pause and acknowledge the fact that we as a field and as individuals are indebted to every people and to every culture throughout the world which make what we do possible. In the same way that African American history is inextricably woven into the fabric and corpus of American and world history, in this same way, the Black or African American philanthropic tradition is a part of the whole of what philanthropy is and what the power of Filio does. Whether brilliantly displayed through the millennia-old West African tribal cultures of the Ashanti, the Igbo, the Kora peoples, or rhythmically captured through the sermons of the slave preachers like John J. Jasper. Whether put on paper by social reformers like Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, or W.E.B. Du Bois, or placed within a musical score by cultural icons like Nina Simone, Billie Holiday, and Jill Scott Heron. Whether spoken to tens of thousands from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., through the dangerous snake-infested waters like Harriet Tubman, or even through the virtues of entrepreneurialism, as displayed by our honoree today, Madam C.J. Walker. The point here is that to expunge or negate the triumphs, realities, and contributions made by African Americans, either from the canon of American or world philanthropic history, is to at the same time diminish and devalue the authentic account of this rich and robust history. For regardless of whatever systems of social, economic, racial, political, and cultural injustice for which African Americans have endured, 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, 35 years of state-sanctioned redlining, the fact is that the spirit of Filio is and has been no less a virtue throughout American history and African American history. And today's celebration is a living reminder of this great fact. And so again, in the spirit of Du Bois, with the wholeness of education in mind, and in the full embodiment of our school's core values of inclusiveness and diversity, on behalf of the entire student-led planning committee for today's celebration, whose names are listed on the reverse of today's program, I say welcome. And it is my earnest supplication that something today will inspire your own work as we collectively and individually continue in our joint vocation of improving philanthropy to improve the world. And so now I am happy to present and publicly thank our Dean for rearranging his busy schedule to join us here today, and for always supporting not only his students, but for truly believing in the core values of this great school. He, along with his wife and son, joined us at the Martin Luther King dinner in January, and we are so blessed to have him here with us today and every day. And so join me in welcoming Dr. Amir Pasek, the Eugene R. Temple Dean, here at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Winterborn, and thank you for assembling this wonderful village of a crew that put this great event together. It's a privilege to have such a beautiful program even to represent our school, and you spoke so eloquently about our school. I'm not sure that I have much to add to that, but let me just also offer my welcome and give you two quick reasons why I think it's so fitting that this presentation is hosted by our school. And it both have to do with this wonderful program, and one has to do with the why and the wonderful kind of synopsis and history of the origin of Black Heritage Month. And I think that's one of the reasons we're hosting, or it's so fitting that we hosted, because of the why question. And it's a question about who we are and why we study the things that we do. So I think that's a wonderful connection there as well. So there's a history of tragedy and triumph that's important to all of us as Americans, even immigrants as myself, as we go forward. So and it's not only important for academic interest, I think. Understanding the diversity of our history as Americans is important as we go forward and try to get things done together and work together. So it addresses, in many ways, I think, both our intellectual and professional culture. I think the other reason that it's so fitting is that the origin of Black Heritage Month came from the philanthropic instinct. It came through associations. The ASALH today, that started the process, and then it was subsequently adopted by mayors and presidents. And so it's fitting that we remember that this whole initiative to celebrate Black heritage began in the philanthropic sector. I think that's really interesting as well. And going forward, I think for our school, it'll be more important to do more of these kinds of events to emphasize the importance of diversity, inclusion as we go forward. In the African American communities, tradition of philanthropy, but also philanthropy in communities of color more broadly. And I think it's important intellectually, and I think it's also important practically for our students as they go into a world that's increasingly diverse, to be able to get things done with people of all kinds of backgrounds. So I want to thank Professor Freeman for his work and for being with us, and thank you, all of you, also for gathering with us today. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chanel Poole. I am a second-year student in the Masters of Arts program here at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, as well as the executive director and founder of a non-for-profit organization called Guidance, Life Skills, and Mentoring here in Indianapolis for at-risk girls and teens. Freetown Village Living History African American Museum is truly a gem and an immeasurable resource to the Indianapolis community. We are happy to have the founder of Freetown Village, Miss Ophelia Wellington, and the other board members here with us today. Please stand. Freetown Village is a living history museum without walls. The trials, triumphs, and daily life of African Americans are presented through theater, storytelling, folk crafts, heritage workshops, music, a summer day camp, and other special events. The town of Freetown Village is a symbolic community representing many of the predominantly African American settlements scattered throughout Indiana during the post-Civil War years. The residents of Freetown Village are composite characters of approximately 3,000 men, women, and children identified on the 1870 Indianapolis census. Today, we are fortunate to witness the Madam Walker story, the amazing story of America's first woman self-made millionaire with strong roots right here in Indianapolis. Today's performance is made possible by a generous gift by Harrison Jones Philanthropic Solutions, LLC, and our own Winterborn Harris Jones, who serves on the Freetown Board of Directors. Ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome the Madam Walker story to the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy.
Oh my goodness, I hear all this clapping. I would love to come in and join you all. Oh, what a wonderful group of individuals you look like. Oh, and I understand you're here to honor my friend, Madam C.J. Walker. But I'm sure you know, she's not around here. She wasn't here yesterday. She's not been here today. Not likely to be around here tomorrow neither. But of course she was here in Indianapolis. She lived in lots of places, but when she left Indianapolis, she went to New York. Oh, let me slow down. Let me slow down before you get all confused. And pardon my name. My name is Edna, Miss Edna Taylor. And Madam Walker, as you call her, is one of my friends. I'm happy to share some information about her. You see, Madam Walker was an early Christmas gift, December 23rd, to Owen and Minerva Breedlove. Owen and Minerva Breedlove. And this was in 1867, just 2 years after the 13th Amendment that made abolished slavery and made it illegal. So she was born 2 years after slavery, and her parents, Owen and Minerva, were so excited and had such high hopes for their first freeborn child. Now, let me tell you something else. Now, Owen and Minerva did not name her Madam. They named her Sarah. Her name was Sarah Breedlove. And Owen and Minerva had such promising hopes for their first freeborn child. Now, Owen and Minerva had 4 other children. They had Virginia. They had Owen Jr., named after his daddy. They had Alexander. They had James. Now, when Sarah was 2 years old, they had another child named him Solomon. Now, what had happened with the older kids who were born into slavery, now they was free too. Now, Owen Sr. was a skilled blacksmith, but the family worked, now that they were free, as sharecroppers. This sharecropping was a title that meant they were no longer slaves, but got to share in the profits after the crops came in. The landowner was their former slave master, and he made sure there was never a profit. It was just a new form of servitude because the Breedloves ended up owing money to the landowner. They lived in Delta, Louisiana. It was hot and muggy down in that area. It's a natural breeding ground. Germs, bacteria, disease. And in 1873 and 1875, Owen and Minerva died. Could have been a disease, could have been cholera, could have been any number of things. But that left these children orphans. Well, by this time, Lavinia, the oldest, was married. And she and her husband Jesse stayed on to try to work the farm. Didn't work out. Sarah was with them. So they moved to nearby Vicksburg, Mississippi, right across the river. Now, Sarah was only 7 years old she began being a washerwoman. Began taking in laundry. And that became her way of owning her own. By the time she was 14, she was married. She was married. She became Mrs. McWilliams. By the time she was 17 or 18, she had her baby. Named her Lydia. Now, Lydia was only maybe 1 or 2 years old. Times were hard and things were rough all over for blacks, and her father was killed. So here, Sarah had to grow up without a father at a young age, and now Lydia is growing up without a father at a young age. Sarah was determined to make a good life for her and her daughter. She continued with the laundry, and by the time Lydia was 15, she had saved up enough money to send her daughter to college, Knoxville College, Knoxville, Tennessee. Knoxville had a high school program that went right into college, so Lydia was taken care of. Now, while Lilia was gone, Sarah decided she needed to improve things for herself too. She needed to get an education, so she began going to night school. She also wanted some of the niceties that she saw the women wearing and doing as she did their laundry. And she wasn't afraid of hard work. She had worked hard all her life. But she just wanted a little bit more for her and for her daughter. By the time she was in her middle 20s and on into her 30s, she began to have issues with her hair. Now, she had health issues, but hygiene was not one of the things that many people were able to keep up with back then. It just wasn't that easy for her. She, by this time, had moved into St. Louis and began working in a church called St. Paul A.M. Church. And in St. Paul, the women's circle embraced her. The people in the community embraced her. They helped her with her education. They helped her with self-esteem. They helped her learn manners. They helped her learn how to give and do good deeds. While she was there, she met and married another man, John Davis. Now, she and John, in St. Louis, he wasn't able to really work because work for black men was very often temporary and seasonal. So she continued to work as a laundress. When her hair was falling out due to health issues, stress about her daughter, and a very rough marriage, which finally did end, she wanted to improve herself. In the 1900s, she met a lady named Annie Minerva Pope Turnbull. And Miss Annie, or some people call her Annie Malone, she had a hair care product that Madam Walker, or Sarah at that time, began to use, and it improved her hair. In fact, Sarah began to work for Annie. She became one of her best salespeople. Absolutely top-notch. She went from door to door, sharing the information about this hair care product and selling these hair care products for Annie. Now, when It got to be the World Fair in St. Louis. Annie met a man who was selling advertisements in newspapers, magazines. His name was Charles Joseph Walker. And Sarah was so impressed with Charles Joseph. He went by C.J. for short. She was impressed with his business sense and his knowledge. Sarah took Annie's business to Denver. She set up shop there, began to spread the word about the products, and began dabbling a little bit with making products of her own. And not too long after she was in Denver, and guess who came from St. Louis to Denver with her? I see it in your mind, C.J. Charles Joseph came right on over to Denver, and not too long after they were there, they got married. Now, what husband is this? Three. Yes, ma'am. This is her third husband. Now, his business sense and his knowledge helped to make the business flourish. In fact, it flourished so well, she did not need to work for Annie any longer. She began her own business under C.J. Walker, her married name. Now, she took on the title Madam because it added a flair of dignity and sophistication to her hair care products. She continued to sell these products along rail lines. She created a demand for her hair care products. But at the same time, she employed women who used to be cooks, domestics, laundress like herself to have pride in themselves and in the business sense, making their own money. By the late 1900s, by the time of her manufacturing, she had over 2,000 women working for her. Now, the average woman back then maybe between $8 and $20 a month. Now, white men back then made between $40 and $60 a month. Madam C.J. Walker is making $300 a month. Very astute businesswoman, very knowledgeable, and the whole time she was given to the community, given to her churches, given to civic organizations. She didn't keep it, she shared it. Just as she picked up those women and brought them into her company, she gave everywhere that she could. She was an advocate against lynchings, segregation, unfair laws. She used her money to help influence everyone she could. She even tried to meet with President Woodrow Wilson. He wouldn't have it, but she tried to get with him to help him realize that some of the laws were just reversing the progress that was being made. But she didn't give up. She continued to work and she continued to give. Now, she and, Lilia was out of school by this time. And she and her husband came here to Indianapolis. This was about 1907, 1908. Came right here to Indianapolis because she heard that this was a good place that she could possibly make a headquarters. Now, I understand that there's a place of where her first home was, a 638 Fairmont, right around the corner here. 5-bedroom flat, and right next to it they bought a house, 640, and put a manufacturer in there. In fact, until she did that, there were no beauty parlors here in Indianapolis for Black women. So she opened herself, her business. She was still giving. She went down to the Isis Theater probably to just relax a bit. The movies back then cost 10 cents. She went, took her dime, gave it to the teller, who pushed it back at her and announced that since she was colored, hers was going to cost 25 cents. Now, I see some of your faces and you know that ain't right. It's not right at all. But out of that, Madam Walker decided that here in Indianapolis, her sisters and brothers needed to have their own place where they could go and watch the movie and not be discriminated against. So in addition to a manufacturing building, she hired an architect to plan a theater that was going to have a coffee house, going to have offices, was going to have a theater where people could go. Now, unfortunately, she did not get to see that building, but it is right around the corner here. Now, let me continue with my friend's story. My friend, Madam Walker. After she left Indianapolis, she went to New York. And up there, her daughter, Lilia, convinced her maybe you ought to stay here. Well, she did build a mansion, called it the Villa Lawaro on the Hudson. Villa Lawaro. L-E for Lilia, W-A for Walker, R-O for Robinson, because Olivia was married by that time, and her last name was Robinson. The Villa Lawaro was a showcase, top of the line, and most people could not believe that woman had enough money to do that. But it was all about her fulfilling a childhood dream. After she built that, she and Lilia helped welcome in the Harlem Renaissance. A friend of hers in St. Louis wanted her to come and help open a new line of hair care products. The doctor warned her against travel, did not want it. But she traveled anyway. She had kidney problems, high blood pressure, cold. She made the trip to St. Louis, but had to be brought back to New York, where she did die. Her daughter took over the business, and H.B. Ransom, who was her general manager for the manufacturing company that she had set up here in Indianapolis, they took over the company, and her daughter, Aurelia, continued to give, but she didn't take care of herself either. Madam Walker died at age 51. Her daughter died at age 46. Giving, but not taking care. Her daughter, Aurelia, she added an A, had a daughter, and her daughter's name was May. Aurelia adopted a daughter named May. May had a daughter named her Aurelia. Then her daughter had a daughter named her Aurelia. It's this Aurelia Bundles, who keeps the name of Madam C.J. Walker Burton. Madam Walker was the first self-made millionaire by her own hand. But let me tell you a couple of things that she's not. She did not invent the straightening comb. And her hair care products were not to make straight hair. It's just to make healthy hair. Madam Walker leaves her legacy of giving, sharing, and picking people up for us to think about. My friend, Madam C.J. Thank y'all for listening to this. I shared her life.
It's not easy to follow such a beautiful and eloquent tribute to the person that we're honoring today, but I'm going to give it my best to introduce our next part of the program, which is our keynote speaker. Familiar to most of you, I think, either professionally or because you've noticed his name in the program. He's part of the school that I'm with, which is the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, where I'm a master's student who's soon to graduate in May. My name's Allison Mitchell, and I'll be describing Dr. Tyrone Freeman just for a few minutes. As you can see, he's both an assistant professor and the director of the undergraduate programs here. What some of you may not know, though, is what he's really focusing on. And today, since we're talking about legacies and we're talking about important questions, I thought we should share what his research is about. Some of the biggest pieces involved in that, he looks at African American philanthropy in both the historical and the contemporary context. Perhaps his love of the history of philanthropy starts because he's got a liberal arts educational background. He has a bachelor's in English and liberal arts from Lincoln University. After that, he's pursued many other degrees. Master's in urban and regional planning at Ball State, another master's in science and adult education from Indiana University, and finally a PhD in philanthropic studies at Indiana. Another question that he'll be focusing on, perhaps today, but in other times as well, would be the philanthropic and fundraising focus of higher education. He's authored several pieces that you'll find in the International Journal of Educational Advancement, Achieving Excellence in Fundraising, both third and fourth editions, as well as Advancing Philanthropy. Finally, I'd like to mention that he's the co-author of the book Race, Gender, and Leadership in Nonprofit Organizations, which was published in 2011. And I'll allow him to tell more about what he's currently working on, which is a piece on Madam C.J. Walker and African American philanthropy during the early Jim Crow era. Please welcome Dr. Tyrone Freeman to the stage.
I want to thank, first of all, the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy for hosting this event and making this possible. Thank you, Dean Passig, for being here and your kind remarks. I want to thank Winterbourne for organizing this and the organizing committee of students and staff for your energy and your efforts. Also want to thank Freetown for the wonderful presentation, and all the friends and colleagues who've taken time out to be here today. Thank you for your time and your interest. The title of my talk is Madam C.J. Walker and the African American Philanthropic Tradition. And so I think we have about 30 or 40 minutes. So what I plan to do is give a sense of who Walker was from a philanthropic standpoint and how that helps us understand philanthropy. But I want to acknowledge the leap year day. Because today is February 29th, we're able to capture this event within February for Black History Month. And I think Madam Walker certainly is worthy of study during Black History Month. But I think also we're reminded that today is supposed to be March 1st, right? And so to me that signals that Madam Walker and philanthropy and communities of color and gender and philanthropy are worthy of study the other 11 months of the year too. Yeah. And that we should constantly seek ways to engage that as we do our work in this field. And so today I want to talk to you about this idea that Madam Walker provides an important window for us into the African American philanthropic tradition. A window that reveals, first, the long-standing historical rootedness of African American philanthropy. Two, African Americans as agents of philanthropy and not only recipients. Three, demonstrates the multiplicity of philanthropy as described by Robert Payton and Michael Moody. And so the premise behind what I'm going to share today is that by understanding Madam Walker's philanthropy, we come to better understand African American philanthropy. And that by better understanding African American philanthropy, we increase our understanding of philanthropy as a human phenomenon. So on to Madam Walker as a philanthropist. When we first are introduced to Madam Walker, there's usually three things that we come to know about her. First, she's the first self-made female millionaire or black female millionaire, depending on how you've heard it. We learn that she's an entrepreneur, and we learn that she is a philanthropist. And so it's easy to kind of grasp her legacy as the millionaire. We understand the dimensions of her wealth. It's easy to recognize the legacy of her company, that the theater's not too far away. And if you've been paying attention to the news recently, you will have heard that her products recently relaunched last week. There's a big ad in Times Square, New York, and will be sold at Sephora starting at the end of this week. So we get those elements, but I've always wondered, what did it mean for her to have been a philanthropist? So I went into the biographical literature about her to try to uncover some of this and make sense of it. And what I found is that there tended to be the same frequent kinds of references to gifts that she had made. So for instance, the 1911 pledge of $1,000 to the colored YMCA here in Indianapolis. Booker T. Washington and many other dignitaries came in to celebrate the launch of that facility. That she was an advocate against lynching, as was mentioned earlier. And her last will and testament was frequently cited because they were charitable provisions to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars. One text also likened her to Andrew Carnegie because she was rich and because she gave back. But there was no significant engagement of Walker as a philanthropist beyond these continuing references. And so I wanted to know more, because as a scholar of philanthropy and a practitioner, I was taught that you have to go beyond the lists. Like, the lists are one thing, but you need to understand the origins of gifts and the motivations for gifts and what's behind them, what's underneath them. And so in order to do that, I started turning to literatures to try to understand this. So I went to the history of American philanthropy and read everything from Brimner to Friedman and McGarvey to more recently Zuntz and many things in between. Madam Walker was not there. Now, this literature tends to be focused on elite institutions, largely white male actors. There certainly are arguments for more inclusive approaches and certainly different attempts to do that, but Walker was not there. So I said, well, if she's not in the literature on American philanthropy, then surely she'll be in the literature on African American philanthropy. And so I read everything from Carson to Gassman and many things in between, and she's not there. This field seems to focus on the forest and not the trees. There's a focus on the group and the group's institutions, like the Black Church, Black fraternal organizations, an emphasis on social movements, such as the Underground Railroad, the Civil Rights Movement, but there's little emphasis on individual actors in this philanthropic tradition. And so Madam Walker was not there either. So I went to the history of women's philanthropy, read everything from McCarthy to Ginsburg and many things in between. She was not there. This literature tended to focus on elite white women or middle-class educated white women. But women of color, regardless of their economic circumstance, and poor women across racial lines were largely absent. So I had to turn directly to Walker herself, and thanks to the Indiana Historical Society, which maintains her collections, I was able to do that and spend a lot of time in those archives. And this was challenging because Walker never wrote about her philanthropy in the way that some of her contemporaries did. Carnegie left us wealth. Olivia Sage left us the opportunities and responsibilities of leisured women. Rosenwald left us the principles of public giving. But Walker didn't write such an essay. But she did speak about her giving. It was reported in newspapers. And so to uncover all this all that it meant that I had to engage in archival work. And so I continued that work, and I began to connect with other literatures that were starting to help make sense of this. So the history of black business became very important, because this history starts before slavery, believe it or not, and continues to the present day. And it revealed much about how black entrepreneurs have historically understood their responsibility to the race. So key insights there. The history of black social welfare was another important literature. It revealed much about how their exclusion from white voluntary associations and social service providers caused African Americans to create their own organizations. They frequently used networks that were anchored by churches and women's clubs to start orphanages and schools and old folks' homes and other facilities to meet the needs of the community. In the history of black women, that was truly a gold mine. The history of black women revealed black women as shapers, practitioners, and purveyors of giving. Whether they were club women or church women or teachers or mothers or washerwomen, the history of black women, I was finding out, was the history of black philanthropy. And there were other insights too. IUPUI's own Paul Mullins and Modupe Labode and others have wrote about how wealth was not white exclusive in an important study on the anthropology of race and wealth. Cheryl Smith from Lesley University, in a study of black women, differences between black women and white women, noted that gender is not always unifying. So I had enough now. These pieces were starting to come together, and I was going to work to articulate Madam Walker's philosophy of philanthropy as I was discerning it from the archives, something I call her gospel of giving. So a key insight for understanding Madam Walker as a philanthropist comes from Walker herself through a series of correspondences she had in 1914 with Booker T. Washington, head of Tuskegee Institute. In a letter to Washington, she proposed a $300 scholarship to support 5 students at Tuskegee. Now, Washington apparently replied with some sort of backhanded comment that hinted at maybe this wasn't enough money or nice, but he was not actually as interested as she might thought. In her letter, she wrote back, it was kind of flabbergasted at his response, but I think she really nailed him pretty good, because after she laid out how her business was growing and what she was trying to do for the race, she made this very interesting statement. She said, "I am unlike your white friends who have waited until they were rich and then help, but have, in proportion to my success, I have reached out and am helping others." So who were Booker T. Washington's friends? Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was on his board and had given him $600,000 for the Tuskegee Endowment. Rosenwald was on the board, so was Baldwin, Lyons, and the other major industrial philanthropists of the era. But here she is in her own words telling Booker T. Washington directly, and posterity indirectly, not to immediately grasp for the prevailing approaches in giving in order to understand her. That the most readily available models may not fit. But if they don't fit, what does fit? And what does she mean, and how are we to understand? So this exchange between Walker and Washington is a defining moment for understanding Walker's philanthropy and its significance. She effectively staked her position in the philanthropic landscape of the 20th century America. Her voice has traveled down through history to challenge our thinking that the seemingly appropriate comparisons to other leading philanthropists of her era are the best way to understand her giving. This directive was important, particularly because it's tempting to compare her to Carnegie in order to contextualize her philanthropy. Scholars have viewed him as the archetypal philanthropist of the era, and his presence and activities are represented as historical markers in the evolution of American philanthropy. But this comparison is problematic because it yields specious conclusions. When Walker is compared to Carnegie, she emerges either as a great exemplar of his philosophy of wealth because she felt a responsibility to use her affluence to help the less fortunate, or as a poor contrast because her total giving was an infinitesimal fraction of Carnegie's. However, Walker's sense of obligation to others did not originate with her acquisition of wealth. It was inculcated and acted upon earlier in her life when she had meager resources, and further, a numbers-based comparison has little value beyond a sorting and ranking function between philanthropists. So both points lack nuance for understanding Walker. Instead, we might turn to New York's Olivia Sage, the prototypical female donor of the period, to contextualize Walker. This analogy may seem appropriate because both were wealthy female philanthropists. They were contemporaries who used their wealth to support social and educational causes. However, this juxtaposition equally falls short because although they shared the same gender, it was inheritance, race, and class that gave Sage a starkly different historical experience that does not explain Madam Walker as a philanthropist at all. As a woman, Madam Walker created her wealth rather than inherited it to rise out of poverty and to a higher social status. Furthermore, she was still black, still female, a combination that has been distinctive in American history. Her specific social experience, along with its historical consequences, must be understood on its own terms. So uncovering and articulating the originating motivations and influences upon Walker have yielded patterns across her giving that can be explained by her early experiences as a poor black female migrant in St. Louis, as was shared earlier, during the 1890s, depended upon a robust philanthropic infrastructure of black civil society organizations and individuals who mentored her and cared for her during the most vulnerable period in her life. These life experiences explain the making of Madam Walker the philanthropist. Sarah Breedlove was generous in her own way by serving in her church and helping her neighbors. Madam Walker's philanthropy was an extension and escalation of Sarah's giving. Sarah did not have the wherewithal to act in broad, organized ways, but Walker did. And she owed this ability to the dreams and persistence of Sarah. Sarah's early life experiences of being in need and being helped by others with greater means formed Madam Walker's moral imagination and provided the foundation for her philanthropic commitment to racial uplift through social services and education. Walker never forgot the women of St. Paul's AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church in St. Louis, who embraced Sarah and quickly connected her to the resources she and her daughter needed to thrive. The social gospel and cultural narratives of her beloved AME church were also important resources that inspired Sarah, with their emphasis on self-help, racial uplift, property ownership, entrepreneurship, international awareness, achievement, and social action, all within the context of the teachings of Jesus Christ. The AME Church was owned, operated, and funded exclusively by African Americans, and its reach extended not only across the country, but overseas. It represented the potential of the race and the possibility of black institutions to serve their communities. As a part of the church, Sarah was exposed to black women who were educated and generous and active in their communities. These church women and club women modeled the practices and traditions of giving, sharing, serving, and leading that undergirded the proliferation of black social and philanthropic institutions that occurred following emancipation in response to the failure of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow. Whether locally through the AME Church or nationally through the National Association of Colored Women, these black women shaped their families and communities in ways that defied the dominant white society's narratives about black inferiority and helplessness. These women socialized Sarah into the manner and being of black women's giving as a way of life. Under their tutelage, Sarah, who was an orphan, widow, and poor, had transitioned from being a recipient to being a donor in realization of her own philanthropic agency. This realization was integral because it set the tone for Walker's philanthropic life, one in which she would give along the way. That is, give gradually and incrementally to help others as she could with what she had, rather than focus her life energies on wealth creation and near life's end, after having secured her own means, arrive at a sense of responsibility for others. Walker took the example of her black female mentors and translated it into what I call a gospel of giving based on 3 tenets. Give as you can to help others, spare no useful means to help others, and give more as your means increase. So for the first point, give as you can to help others. This speaks to the gradual and incremental approach to giving, which says start where you are, because anyone can give and be helpful. You don't have to wait until you're wealthy. And Sarah's first documented gift came in her late teens or early 20s when she raised money and gathered food for an indigent neighbor. Also, the others in this first point bear some elaboration, because in traditional Western models of giving, there's a sense that there should be some social distance between givers and receivers. By focusing on the other directedness of giving, these Western models hope to distinguish between altruistic motivations and legal or sanguinary responsibilities, and later to justify tax deductions. But there's a fluidity in the African American philanthropy tradition in which little distinction existed between gifts between friends, family, and others when making gifts for the purposes of navigating and overcoming the scourge of race. Point 2, spare no useful means that may be helpful to others. In African American philanthropy, giving has historically found expression through multiple channels, traditional and untraditional. Walker deployed monetary and non-monetary gifts, such as time, but she also gave employment, education, pride in personal appearance, inspiration, food, and other tangible goods. Consequently, her agents, her company, and her life story stood alongside her time and her money as key philanthropic resources put in service to racial uplift. The third point, give more as your means increase. She expanded the ways in which she gave according to the growth in means she experienced. So wealth was merely an accelerator of her giving rather than an impetus for it. Her last will, which could be considered a culminating gift, then became a tool for ensuring that the gifts made across her lifetime would continue in their various forms and would be complemented by new ones, such as real estate and provisions for the proper and dignified burial of friends and family members. So while Walker had learned and had begun practicing this first tenet of gospel of giving in St. Louis and applied the second tenet, spare no useful means, and the third tenet, give more as your means increase, through her company and the diverse gifts made across her lifetime and afterwards. She had created and operated her company to pursue both commercial and philanthropic goals by improving black women's personal hygiene and appearance, increasing their access to vocational education, beauty culture careers, and financial independence, and promoting social bonding and activism through associationalism. She used the means available to her to give gifts that had made opportunity and hope available to everyday African Americans so that they could fulfill their potential in spite of the horrific and unfair circumstances of the time, which in turn moved America closer towards the country it purported to be. She operationalized her kind of philanthropy through a variety of roles that expand our understanding of philanthropy. Of course, she was a donor who gave money, time, goods, services, and support to friends, family, neighbors, strangers, and organizations in need. But she's also an educator in this philanthropic tradition, who through her national chain of privately funded beauty schools prepared and credentialed black women for careers and continually urged them in their quest for self-improvement. She was a speaker and a storyteller who motivated black audiences through her own narrative of ascent and challenged them to see themselves in her story and take action in order to overcome the negative and dehumanizing narratives from Jim Crow about what blackness meant and who they were. She was an organizer who assembled her sales agents into benevolent clubs and organized them around the country and asked them to do charity in their regions because she knew the collective power of women and enabled their mobilization on behalf of their communities. She was a convener who gathered and hosted race leaders to discuss the problems of the race and strategize plans for action. And she was an employer of the unemployable who offered opportunity and hope through the dignity of work to a people who were locked out of the private sector and locked into the most menial jobs. And lastly, she was a sharer who knew the joy of giving and was bountiful in her interactions with others. These philanthropic roles were how Walker embodied and operationalized this gospel of giving as an expression of her character and how she blended her identity as a church woman, a club woman, a race woman, and a businesswoman with that of being a mother and a friend. Part of the power of this gospel of giving can be attributed to its grounding in black women's identification with and close proximity to suffering. Iris Carlton Lene and Sandra Alexander have shown how black club women in the early 20th century had physical, social, and psychological proximity to the individuals for whom they advocated. This nearness enabled them to maintain firsthand information about community problems and issues, and thus yielded authentic and careful perspectives on local needs. Virtually all of Walker's gifts harkened back to some type of gift that she once needed or received herself. And no matter how much money she accumulated, nor how many properties she purchased, she was still black, still female, and therefore still subject to the racialized norms and gender dynamics of Jim Crow society. In this manner, she had the same philanthropic need for freedom as any other African American. To be sure, her wealth gave her some insulation from racialized and gendered insult. Her ownership of automobiles spared her the indignities of segregated train travel during her extensive promotional tours throughout the South and across the country. However, at any time, Walker could have been lynched, raped, humiliated, discriminated against, or otherwise terrorized, just as any other black woman in America. Although many of Washington's white supporters had known poverty and ignorance in their earlier lives, they were rescued from that former station by their wealth, and the privileges of race accrued to them in those efforts. For them, such conditions remained only memories that could be conjured or ignored at will. Walker could never fully escape the conditions upon her life based upon her skin color and gender without radical social change. This reality has served as a defining characteristic of much of African American philanthropy. So in some ways, the history of African American philanthropy has been the search for hospitality in a land of hostility. Blacks use whatever means available to them to make life tolerable and navigable during the long-suffering and uncertain trek towards freedom and equality. This response was required due to the surging malevolence of late 19th and early 20th century white-controlled governments, markets, and voluntary associations that created and maintained the social, political, and economic conditions of black life by denying legal protections, economic opportunities, and access to services. Among other things, for blacks, these public and private societal actors and institutions perpetuated inequality and made life extraordinarily difficult. With their earlier hopes for Reconstruction demolished, blacks had to do for themselves in order to survive, as they had been doing since their arrival. Now, along the way, there was help. Sympathetic white allies provided much needed support in various forms, money, material items, school buildings, teachers. Somehow, those efforts took precedence in public perception and historical interpretation over those of African Americans themselves, who came to be viewed as passive recipients of the largesse of others. Madam Walker reconnects us to this long-standing historical rootedness of black philanthropy and to the African American Philanthropic Agency. She represents the millions of black women across the centuries who pooled their resources together whenever they could to service the race. The countless, nameless church women, club women, washerwomen, teachers, mothers, and other activists relentlessly toiled for the race and transmitted giving as a way of life across the generations. Indeed, Madam Walker's giving was black women's giving writ large, as she amplified the practices she was taught by her black women female mentors. Additionally, Madam Walker leads us to other black women of means who accumulated significant wealth and were equally generous, such as Annie Malone, who was mentioned earlier, another hair care tycoon, if you will, a millionaire who was equally philanthropic and had thousands of agents across the country. And Sarah Spencer Washington, who had the Apex Company, another millionaire of the same era, doing the same work that Walker was doing. By understanding black women as philanthropists, we increase our understanding of women as philanthropists. Presently, the experiences of elite white women dominate the history of women's philanthropy field. But Madam Walker gives us access to a world of black, poor, and working class and highly educated middle class black women working together to uplift their communities. Cheryl Smith's admonishment that gender is not always unifying reminds us of the need to account for variations in women's experiences, which can best be done by engaging with women of different backgrounds. Walker definitely helps us understand the dynamics of race and gender in philanthropy, and she also helps us access key concepts in our field of philanthropic studies as a way to understand philanthropy as a human phenomenon. And we should feel free to engage her to explore and teach our students and engage in conversations about topics such as meliorism, moral imagination, social entrepreneurship, associationalism, ritualism and philanthropy, the bending and blurring of the sectors, testamentary giving, and the worthy poor. Her example has utility beyond the constraints of February and March that can help our field better understand its primary subject. And by deepening our understanding of philanthropy and of African Americans and of women, my analysis of Walker ultimately helps us better grasp American philanthropy. We've not seen a woman like Walker before in the major historical narratives of philanthropy in America. That is, the independently wealthy, philanthropic woman who created rather than inherited her wealth, and who maintained lifelong proximity to the conditions she sought to improve through her giving. Hers was not a gospel of giving birth to rationalize a political or economic system that made the substantial wealth creation of a relative few possible. This was not a gospel of giving prompted by a new realization that one had more resources than one could possibly or reasonably consume, or by a sudden or even unexpected influx of inheritance that created such possibilities. This was a gospel of giving forged directly from the collective experience of black women in the late 19th and early 20th century as they wrestled with the absurdity of American racial and gender oppression. As such, it created impact over time, it assumed various forms and function, and it found its fullest expression and maximum effect in partnership with the giving of others. It expressed black women's dignity, identity, agency, and humanity as they chose their constructive responses to seemingly destructive and impossible circumstances. So Walker's gospel of giving is instructive for those interested in the broader lessons of history. It proffers that giving is personal and a community responsibility that commences with birth, rather than something that commences later in life after you've secured resources or your resources have reached surplus status. It recognizes that the giver has also received much throughout life, and that the giver and the recipient can be the same. It holds that no one is too close or too far from the giver for a philanthropic gift to be made, including blood relations, extended family, and strangers. It does not distinguish between spheres of action to bring about social change, because ultimately all available means, private and public, must be pursued in order to be successful because of the pervasiveness and depth of need. It promotes cooperation and collaboration in order to magnify and multiply the impact of giving. It views virtually any resource that has potential to alleviate suffering or bring about meaningful change in overcoming personal and societal obstacles as being useful philanthropic currency, be it time, money, employment, education, beauty, influence, inspiration, or tangible goods. And finally, Walker's gospel of giving holds that giving should be known and celebrated, so as to model generosity and inspire others to action. In this light, it's become clear that Walker, as a historical figure, was more than just another rich person who donated her money, or another African American who helped to fight racism, or another woman who helped other women.